The title, seamstress, felt like a cruel joke to Eliza now. Her hands, once nimble and precise, trembled as she counted the last of her money on the cold, bare kitchen counter. The metallic clink of the coins was a sound of finality, each one a tiny hammer blow against her heart. $50. That was all that stood between her two small children and the vast, uncaring world. Her stomach twisted, a familiar knot of hunger and dread that had become her constant companion. The house echoed with a hollowness that had nothing to do with the lack of furniture, which the bank had already claimed. It was the crushing silence left by her husband, a silence that 6 months had not managed to fill, but only deepen and make more raw. A crisp, white envelope lay on the counter, the eviction notice a stark tombstone marking the death of her life here. Every breath she took felt like inhaling dust and failure. A cold draft snaked under the door, a premonition of the brutal cold that awaited them outside these walls. She felt her heart squeeze into a tight, painful fist. This wasn't just losing a home. It was the complete erasure of a life built with love and now dismantled by debt. In the living room, her son, Luke, who was only 8, was trying to be brave for her. He sat on the floor, drawing stick figures in the thin layer of dust, a silent protest against the emptiness that had swallowed their home. Her daughter, Sophie, just 6, clung to her leg, her small face buried in the worn fabric of Eliza's jeans, her body trembling with quiet sobs. The sound was a constant, a heartbreaking soundtrack to their ruin. Eliza stroked her daughter's hair, the silky strands a painful reminder of everything soft and good she could no longer provide. She felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. How could she explain to them that their beds, their toys, their entire world was gone? The medical bills from her husband's losing battle with cancer had been a relentless tide, pulling them under slowly at first, then all at once in a final, devastating wave. She looked at their faces, one trying to be a little man, the other a terrified child, and a fresh surge of grief and guilt washed over her. She was their mother. She was supposed to be their shield. Instead, she had led them to this precipice of homelessness, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the ghosts of a happier time. There was one last thing, a single, flimsy piece of paper she'd almost thrown away years ago. The deed to a plot of land, miles away in the middle of nowhere. It was a forgotten inheritance from a great uncle she'd never even met, a man whose name was just a whisper from her own mother's childhood stories. On the deed, scrawled in faded ink, was the description, a rural plot, and on it a barn. It had always been a curiosity, a piece of family trivia. Now, it was a lifeline, or perhaps just a different kind of anchor designed to pull them down faster. The thought of it sent a shiver down her spine. Moving to an abandoned barn felt like admitting a final, catastrophic defeat. It was a regression, a step back into a primitive struggle she never imagined for her family. But the alternative was a homeless shelter, the thought of which sent a fresh spike of sheer panic through her chest. The shelter meant surrendering completely, becoming a statistic. The barn, as terrifying as it was theirs. It was a terrible choice, a decision born not of hope, but of the complete and utter absence of any other option. Her decision solidified with the cold weight of certainty. Anything was better than the street. She packed what little they had left into her old, sputtering car, a few bags of clothes, a box of kitchen essentials, and her one remaining tool of a former life, her heavy sewing machine. The cast-iron machine was a dead weight, a monument to a future that would never be, but she couldn't bring herself to leave it. It was a part of her soul. As she buckled a sleeping Sophie into her car seat and gave Luke a weak, reassuring smile he didn't believe for a second, the finality of the moment crushed the air from her lungs. She took one last look at the small suburban house, its windows like vacant eyes staring back at her. This was where she had brought her babies home from the hospital. This was where she had kissed her husband goodbye for the last time. Now, it was just a building, a shell filled with memories that no longer belonged to her. The engine turned over with a painful groan, the sound of a tired beast being forced into one last, desperate journey. She pulled away from the curb, not daring to look in the rearview mirror, driving away from the wreckage of her life toward an unknown and likely hostile horizon. The $50 felt like a lead weight in her pocket. It had to cover gas for a journey of unknown length and food for 3 mouths that were already aching with hunger. Eliza drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, the hum of the tires on the asphalt a monotonous drone against the storm raging inside her. She felt hollowed out, a walking ghost animated only by the primal need to keep her children safe. Each mile that passed was a mile further from everything she had ever known, and a mile closer to a dilapidated barn that existed only in her most desperate imaginings. The hope she tried to cling to was fragile, a tiny, flickering candle flame in the hurricane of her fear. Was this the ultimate act of a failed mother, dragging her children into an even deeper pit of squalor? Or was there, somewhere in this insane gamble, a sliver of a chance? The weight of this question pressed down on her, heavier than any debt. Her story is a testament to the fact that even in the darkest hour, a new path can appear. To find out if this path leads to salvation or an even greater nightmare, make sure you are subscribed and click the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. The city's grey decay slowly bled into stretches of indifferent highway. For hours, the only sounds were the tired drone of the engine, the rhythmic thump of the tires on cracked asphalt, and Sophie's soft, sleeping breaths from the back seat. Eliza gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles bone white, her eyes fixed on the endless ribbon of road ahead. She tried to manufacture hope, to picture a rustic, livable space, a garden, a new start. But the image was a fragile, transparent thing, easily shattered by the gnawing reality of her situation. $50. The number echoed in her mind with every mile marker they passed, a tiny, pathetic shield against starvation. The air in the car was stale, thick with the scent of old upholstery and the faint, sour smell of fear. She felt a profound loneliness, a feeling of being utterly untethered from the world, a small, forgotten ship drifting into a vast, dark ocean. Her heart hammered a nervous, frantic beat against her ribs, a drum signaling their approach to an unknown fate. Luke was unnervingly quiet in the back, his face pressed against the glass, watching the world blur by. He hadn't cried or complained, his 8-year-old mind seeming to understand the gravity of their exodus in a way that terrified Eliza. His silence was an accusation she couldn't answer. She could feel his small, worried eyes on the back of her head, asking questions she had no answers for. Where are we going? Will we be okay? Are you scared, Mum? Yes. She wanted to scream. I'm terrified. A cold dread, thick and suffocating, settled in the pit of her stomach. The landscape was changing, the familiar clutter of suburban life giving way to wide-open fields and sparse, lonely farmhouses. Each one they passed felt like a silent judgment on her failure, a happy family portrait she could no longer be a part of. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and pink, a beautiful spectacle that only served to mock the ugliness of her despair. A tear escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. The gas gauge was her enemy, a relentless needle inching its way toward empty. She had calculated it a dozen times, praying her math was right, that they had just enough fuel to reach the property. The thought of being stranded on this empty road with her children was a nightmare she couldn't afford to entertain. She focused on the tangible, the feel of the vibrating wheel, the faint warmth of the setting sun on her arm. She tried to project an aura of calm for Luke's sake, humming a tuneless melody that sounded brittle and hollow even to her own ears. The opportunity, as she had tried to frame it, felt less like a gift and more like a punishment, a forgotten great uncle, a piece of cursed land. What kind of salvation could possibly be found in a place no one had wanted for decades? The hope she'd clung to was wearing thin, fraying at the edges with every passing mile. It was no longer a flicker of light, but the faint, dying glow of an ember, about to be extinguished by the coming night and the crushing weight of reality. The smooth asphalt finally gave way to a jarring gravel road that rattled the old car's frame and shook Eliza's teeth. The sound was abrasive, a grinding protest from the vehicle that seemed to share her reluctance. The directions, scrawled on a yellowed piece of paper, were becoming more cryptic. Turn left at the dead oak tree. Follow the dirt path past the stone wall. It felt like a scavenger hunt designed by a ghost. The world outside the windows had become a study in browns and greys. Tangled, leafless trees clawed at the sky, and overgrown fields lay dormant and forgotten. The sense of isolation was absolute. She hadn't seen another car for nearly an hour. A profound chill crept over her skin, a coldness that had nothing to do with the evening air. It was the chill of complete separation from civilization, from help, from any semblance of safety. Her breath hitched in her chest. This wasn't just rural. It was a void, a place where people disappeared. The engine sputtered once, a terrifying cough that sent a jolt of pure panic through her. She saw it then, a rusted, leaning metal post, nearly swallowed by thorny vines. A dark shape was nailed to it, and as she slowed the car to a crawl, she could just make out the flaking paint of a name. Miller. Her great-uncle's name. A tremor ran through her hands. This was it, the final turn. The path leading away from the gravel road was barely a path at all, just two faint ruts carved into the earth, overgrown with weeds that scraped against the undercarriage of the car with a screeching sound. It felt like a violation, forcing her way into a place that was actively trying to repel her. The trees closed in overhead, their branches interlocking to form a dark, oppressive canopy that blocked out the last of the dying sunlight. The air grew still and heavy, thick with the smell of damp soil and decaying leaves. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn back, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped, her only path leading forward, deeper into the darkness. The car bumped and lurched over the uneven ground for what felt like an eternity, the headlights cutting a weak, trembling swath through the encroaching twilight. Then, the path opened into a small, weed-choked clearing, and she saw it. The barn. It stood against the bruised purple sky not as a structure of refuge, but as a skeletal silhouette, a dark, hulking beast hunched against the earth. A profound silence fell as she killed the engine, a silence so deep it felt loud, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind whistling through gaps in the building's frame. For a single, insane moment, a flicker of that false hope returned. A roof. It had a roof. It was four walls. It was something. But the illusion shattered as her eyes adjusted to the gloom. It wasn't just old or neglected. It was a carcass, a ruin. The hope didn't just die. It was violently murdered before her eyes, leaving a gaping wound in her chest. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she gripped the steering wheel to steady herself. She forced the car door open, the hinge groaning in protest. The air that rushed in was not the fresh, clean air of the countryside she had imagined. It was a foul miasma, a thick, cloying stench of rot, mold, and something else, a smell of profound and ancient neglect. Of death. The ground squelched beneath her worn shoes, a mixture of mud and decomposing vegetation. She took a few hesitant steps closer, her entire body trembling. The wooden planks of the barn's walls were not just weathered, they were eaten away, riddled with holes and covered in a slick, green film of moss and fungus. Several massive boards had fallen away entirely, leaving dark, gaping wounds in the structure's side. The main doors, as tall as two men, hung askew on rusted hinges, one of them barely attached, swaying slightly in the breeze with a rhythmic, agonizing creak, creak, creak. It was the sound of utter desolation, a funeral dirge for her last, desperate gamble. Her stomach churned with nausea. Luke and Sophie had woken up. She could hear their small, frightened whispers from the car. "What is that smell, Mommy?" Luke asked, his voice small and thin in the oppressive quiet. Eliza couldn't answer. She couldn't form words. Her throat was tight with unshed tears and a rising tide of panic. She approached the gaping maw of the entrance, peering into the cavernous darkness within. The interior was a nightmare. Man-sized holes in the roof let in slivers of the pale moonlight, illuminating a chaotic scene of decay. A mountain of old hay, black and slimy with dampness, dominated the center of the floor. It was tangled with rusted farm equipment, broken barrels, and piles of unidentifiable debris. The floor itself was a treacherous landscape of packed dirt, mud puddles, and what looked like a thriving ecosystem of fungus. A sudden scuttling sound from the shadows made her jump back, her heart leaping into her throat. Rats. Of course there were rats. The place was not empty. It was teeming with the life that thrives on death and decay. This wasn't a home. It wasn't even a shelter. It was a hazard, a disease-ridden death trap. There was no electricity, no running water, no glass in the few window frames that remained, just rot and darkness and the stench of abandonment. The sheer, overwhelming hopelessness of it all crashed down on her like a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. She felt her knees buckle, and she leaned against the cold, damp frame of the doorway for support, splinters digging into her palm. This was the bottom. She had thought she was at the bottom when she was evicted, when she had only $50 to her name. She had been wrong. This was the true abyss, dragging her children from a clean, empty house to this plague pit. A sob, raw and guttural, finally tore itself from her throat. It was the sound of a spirit breaking, of a mother realizing she had failed in the most fundamental way possible. She had not led them to safety. She had led them into the jaws of a greater despair. A distant light flickered, then another. A house, perhaps a mile down the main dirt road she had turned off from. Then, the rumble of a pickup truck. It slowed as it passed the entrance to her path, its headlights sweeping across the clearing for a moment, illuminating her pathetic car and the skeletal barn in a harsh, interrogating glare. Eliza shrank back into the shadows, feeling exposed and vulnerable. She could feel the eyes of the people in that truck, even from a distance. She could feel their curiosity, their judgment. She was an intruder, an anomaly in their quiet, isolated world. The truck didn't stop. It sped up, kicking up a cloud of dust as it disappeared down the road. The message was clear. You are not welcome here. The isolation she had felt on the drive was now a suffocating reality. There would be no welcoming neighbor with a hot casserole here. There would be no help, just suspicion and distance. The wind picked up, carrying with it a low, mournful howl that seemed to echo the emptiness in her soul. The whispers she had overheard from a clerk back in the county seat, a town she'd passed through to check the property records, came back to her now, a warning she had dismissed as local gossip. That old Miller place. No one's gone near it in 30 years, the man had said, leaning over the counter with a conspiratorial gleam in his eye. Cursed, they say. Old man Miller died out there. Freak accident. Place has had bad luck ever since. Cursed. The word, which had sounded so foolish and superstitious in a brightly lit office, now felt tangible in the oppressive darkness. It clung to the damp air, seeped from the rotting wood, and echoed in the sound of the wind. She felt a primal fear, a cold dread that went beyond the physical state of the barn. It was the feeling of stepping into a place where something terrible had happened, a place whose misery was so profound it had permanently stained the very land it stood on. A shiver, violent and uncontrollable, racked her body. "Mommy, I'm cold." Sophie's small voice cut through the darkness, trembling and fragile. The sound snapped Eliza out of her frozen despair and into a new kind of agony. Her children. They were cold, hungry and terrified, sitting in the car while their mother stood paralyzed at the threshold of a nightmare. The immediate physical needs of her children were an anchor, pulling her back from the edge of the abyss. But to what? To the impossible task of making this hellhole survivable for a single night. She felt a surge of self-loathing so intense it made her feel sick. What had she done? She had romanticized survival, clinging to a foolish, desperate idea that a roof, any roof, was enough. Now she saw the truth. Some roofs were worse than the open sky. This barn wasn't a shelter, it was a tomb, and she had just brought her children to its door. Every fiber of her being screamed to get back in the car and drive away, but there was nowhere to go and no gas to get there. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that tasted of mold and earth, she turned away from the barn and walked back to the car. She had to be strong. She had to pretend. For them. She opened the back door, forcing a smile onto her face that felt like a painful grimace. "Okay, little explorers," she said, her voice hoarse and brittle. "This is our new adventure. It's a bit of a fixer-upper, isn't it?" Luke just stared at her, his eyes wide with a wisdom far beyond his years. He knew she was lying. He could see the terror behind her mask. Sophie, however, was too young for such cynicism. She looked from Eliza's face to the dark shape of the barn, and back again. "It's scary," she whispered, her lower lip trembling. "I know, sweetie," Eliza said, her own voice breaking. "But we're all together, and that's what matters. We'll be brave together." The words felt like ash in her mouth. A bitter lie told to the two people she loved most in the world. She had never felt less brave in her entire life. She pulled blankets from one of their bags, the familiar, soft fabric, a small comfort against the overwhelming strangeness of the place. The first priority was sleep. They couldn't stay in the car. It was too cold and cramped. The only option was the barn. The thought sent another wave of revulsion through her. She would have to clear a space in that filth, lay down blankets on a floor that had been home to rats and decay for decades. She grabbed the car's small, hand-crank flashlight, its beam weak and wavering. "Luke, I need you to be my big, brave helper," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to make a campsite inside." He nodded silently, his face pale in the faint glow of the interior car light. Together, they would have to face the darkness inside that rotting structure. The dread was a physical presence, a cold hand squeezing her heart. This wasn't the bottom of the well. This was a new, deeper level of hell she hadn't known existed. She was utterly and completely broken. As she stood there, flashlight in hand, poised to enter the monstrous barn with her son, a pair of headlights appeared again at the end of the long, dirt path. It was the same pickup truck as before, but this time, it stopped. The engine cut, plunging the world back into an even deeper silence, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic pounding of Eliza's own heart. Two dark figures got out of the truck. They didn't approach. They just stood there, two silhouettes against the faint glow of the distant town, watching. Their stillness was more menacing than any action could have been. It was a silent, ominous warning. They were being watched. The neighbors weren't just suspicious. They were hostile. The feeling of the curse intensified, twisting in her gut. She was not just a failure in a ruin. She was a trespasser in a hostile land, and the darkness of the barn was suddenly the least of her worries. The true threat was out here in the shadows, watching and waiting. The silence of the night had been a fragile shield, but the dawn broke it with merciless brutality. Eliza awoke not to the gentle glow of morning, but to a cold grey light filtering through the gaping holes in the roof, illuminating the squalor in stark detail. The air she breathed was heavy and damp, thick with the smell of mold and wet earth that seemed to have seeped into her very bones. A deep ache radiated from her back, a protest against the hard, uneven ground where she had barely slept, curled protectively around Sophie, while Luke shivered beside them under a thin blanket. Her stomach twisted with a familiar, gnawing hunger. The $50, now significantly less after buying a meager supply of bread and water, felt like a useless talisman against this monumental ruin. A cold knot of despair tightened in her chest. For a moment, she was paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of it all, the feeling of being swallowed by a nightmare from which she could not wake. She was a captain who had steered her ship directly into the rocks. Her children's needs were the only force strong enough to move her. Sophie's small whimper, a quiet protest against the cold, was a dagger in her heart. Luke was already awake, sitting up and staring at the rotting hay with wide, haunted eyes. The sight of his silent fear was more painful than any cry. Eliza forced her aching limbs to move, a puppet animated by maternal instinct. Her first task was simple, yet felt as daunting as climbing a mountain. She had to make a space. A clean space. The idea was almost laughable in this cavern of decay. She would have to fight back against 30 years of neglect with her bare hands. She grabbed a splintered piece of a broken plank, a pathetic excuse for a shovel, and faced the mountain of rotten hay in the center of the barn. It was a dark, slimy mass, and the thought of what might be living inside it sent a wave of nausea through her. But it had to be done. There was no other choice. Her heart hammered with a grim, joyless resolve. This was her penance. She began to work, her movements stiff at first, then more fluid as a desperate energy took over. The work was grueling, back-breaking. She scraped and pushed the heavy, sodden hay, the foul stench of its decomposition filling her lungs and clinging to her clothes. The sound was a wet, sucking squelch, punctuated by her own ragged breaths. Dust and mold spores filled the air, catching in the weak morning light like a foul, glittering snow. She felt sweat trickle down her back despite the chill. With every push, a small cloud of unseen things would burst from the hay, making her skin crawl. She uncovered rusted chains, broken bottles, and the skeletal remains of some small animal, which she quickly covered again, her stomach lurching violently. She felt like an archaeologist excavating a tomb, uncovering layers of filth and forgotten time. The sheer volume of it was overwhelming. Hours could pass, and it would feel as if she had made no progress at all. A tiny human battling an ocean of rot. Luke and Sophie watched her from the relative safety of the blankets they'd laid out near the doorway. Sophie clutched a small, dirty doll she had found in the car, her face a mask of quiet misery. Eliza's heart ached for them. This was their playground now, a landscape of filth and danger. To distract himself from the oppressive fear, Luke began to invent a game. He designated small, less filthy patches of the dirt floor as safe zones and the piles of debris as monster lairs. He moved with a forced, jerky energy, trying to conjure a sense of adventure where there was only dread. He started a game of hide-and-seek, though there was no one to seek him. He would count to 10, his small voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space, then run to find a new hiding spot. Eliza watched him out of the corner of her eye, a fresh wave of guilt washing over her. She had forced her son to play games with ghosts and shadows just to keep from screaming. It was a testament to his resilience, and to her failure. He darted behind a stack of rotted barrels, then reappeared, looking for a better spot. He ran toward the center of the barn, to the area Eliza had partially cleared. His feet, clad in worn sneakers, pounded on the packed earth. Then he took a step, and the sound was different. It wasn't the soft thud of dirt. It was a hollow, resonant thump, a wooden sound where there should have been only earth. He stopped, confused, and jumped on the spot again. Thump, thump. It was a distinct, drum-like noise that cut through the quiet hum of the wind and the scuttling of unseen things. Eliza paused her work, her makeshift shovel resting in the hay. She had been so consumed by her task that the sound took a moment to register. It was out of place, an anomaly in the symphony of decay. "Luke, what was that?" she called out, her voice raspy from the dust and exertion. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a flicker of something other than fear, curiosity. "The floor is talking, Mum," he said, his voice a hushed whisper. A strange feeling, one she hadn't felt in months, stirred within her. It was a faint, electric prickle of intrigue. She walked over to where Luke stood, her boots sinking slightly into the cleared patch of dirt. She knelt down, the damp earth seeping cold through the knees of her jeans. She pressed her hand flat against the ground where he had jumped. It was hard, but as she brushed away the loose topsoil, her fingers met not more dirt, but the rough, splintered grain of wood. A board. It was a single, wide floorboard, almost completely buried, its color a near-perfect match to the dark, packed earth around it. It was expertly camouflaged, placed in a section of the barn where the floor seemed to be nothing but dirt. It made no sense. Why would a single plank be here, isolated from any other wooden flooring? A shiver, not of cold, but of a different, deeper feeling, traced its way up her spine. The curse of the barn whispered in the back of her mind. This was wrong. This was a secret. Her hands trembled slightly as she began to dig at the edges with her fingers. The dirt was packed tight, as hard as cement. The board didn't budge. "It's stuck," Luke said, peering over her shoulder. Eliza looked around, her eyes scanning the piles of debris for a tool. She spotted the rusty tire iron she had brought in from the car, a piece of practical forethought that now felt like fate. She wedged the tip of the iron into the thin crack between the wood and the earth and pushed. The metal groaned in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. She repositioned it, getting a better angle, and put her weight into it. There was a sharp, cracking sound, the noise of ancient dirt seals being broken. The edge of the board lifted just a fraction of an inch, releasing a puff of stale, musty air that smelled different from the rest of the barn. It was a dry, close smell, the scent of a space that hadn't breathed for a very, very long time. Her heart began to beat faster, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She worked the tire iron around the perimeter, her movements becoming more urgent. The board was heavy, made of thick, dense oak. It wasn't nailed down. As she pried and lifted, she realized it was fitted into a perfectly cut recess, a masterful piece of carpentry designed to be invisible. Whoever had placed this here had not wanted it found. The thought sent another jolt through her, a mixture of fear and a wild, burgeoning hope. What if this was something else? Not another horror, but an answer. With a final grunt of effort, she heaved the board up and flipped it over. It landed with a heavy thud, revealing the space beneath. For a sickening moment, her heart sank. It was just more dirt, dark, packed and empty. A wave of disappointment washed over her, so potent it made her feel dizzy. Of course, it was nothing. Just a forgotten piece of old construction, another dead end in her miserable labyrinth of failure. She almost told Luke it was nothing, to go back and play, but her hand, resting on the surface of the exposed dirt, felt something. A small, hard lump just beneath the surface. Her breath caught in her throat. She dismissed the disappointment and began to dig again with her bare hands, her nails scraping against the packed earth. The soil was firm, but not impenetrable. She clawed at it, a desperate, almost feral energy taking over. The hard object was smooth, cool to the touch. It wasn't a rock. She scraped away the last of the dirt, her heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm in her ears. And then she saw it, a small dark circle of metal tarnished with age, lying flush with the ground. It was an iron ring, a handle, sunk into what she now realized was not just dirt, but the top of a stone slab, a door, a trapdoor. The sight of it stole the air from her lungs. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional. This was a secret hidden in plain sight, waiting. Luke gasped beside her. "It's a treasure door," he whispered. His voice filled with awe. Eliza's mind reeled, trying to process the impossible sight. A trapdoor, in the middle of this god-forsaken barn. The whispers about her great-uncle, the freak accident, the curse, designed to keep people away, it all swirled in her head, coalescing into a single terrifying thought. This was the reason. Whatever lay beneath this stone slab was the heart of the property's mystery. A cold dread mixed with a feverish excitement. She looked at the ring, her hand hovering over it, trembling. What horrors could be waiting in the darkness below? Snakes, a flooded cistern, a collapsed cellar. Her mind supplied a dozen terrifying possibilities. But the alternative, the slow, grinding despair of her current reality, was in its own way just as terrifying. She had nothing to lose. She had already hit the bottom. This, whatever it was, could only go up. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she hooked her fingers through the cold rough iron of the ring. She pulled. It didn't move. It felt as if it were fused to the earth, anchored to the very center of the world. She gritted her teeth, braced her feet against the edge of the opening, and pulled again, this time with her entire body. Her muscles screamed in protest. A low, groaning sound came from below, the sound of stone grinding against stone after decades of silence. A thin crack appeared around the edge of the slab, dust and dirt trickling into the unseen space below. The seal was breaking. With a surge of adrenaline, she gave one last, desperate heave. The heavy stone door shifted, then lifted, swinging upwards on massive, hidden hinges with a deep, sonorous groan that echoed through the entire barn. A wave of cool, musty air washed over her face, a scent completely alien to the rot of the barn above. It was the smell of a tomb, of sealed-off time, of deep earth and stone and something else, the faint, dry scent of old paper and leather. It was the smell of secrets. A perfect square of absolute blackness now gaped in the floor. Eliza's first instinct was to slam the door shut, to pretend she had never found it. The fear was a living thing, a cold presence coiling in her gut. She was a seamstress, a mother. She was not a treasure hunter, not an explorer of dark and forgotten places, but the faces of her children, pale and worried in the gloom, solidified her resolve. She couldn't stop now. She had to know. She retrieved the small, hand-crank flashlight from their meager pile of belongings, its beam a pathetic weapon against the profound darkness. "Stay right here," she ordered the children, her voice steadier than she felt. "Don't come near this opening. Do you understand?" Luke nodded solemnly, while Sophie just buried her face in his side. Eliza cranked the flashlight, the whining sound loud in the tense silence, then aimed its weak, flickering beam into the hole. The light cut through the black, revealing a small flight of stone steps, slick with condensation, descending into the unknown. Her heart hammered against her ribs as if trying to escape her chest. Every nerve screamed at her to stop, to run. But the pull of the mystery was intoxicating, a powerful drug for a soul starved of anything but misery. Holding the flashlight in one trembling hand, she lowered herself onto the top step. The stone was shockingly cold and slick with a fine layer of moisture. She took one step, then another, her footfalls making soft, echoing sounds in the confined space. The air grew colder. the scent of damp earth and stone intensifying with every step down. The flashlight beam danced wildly, throwing grotesque, elongated shadows on the walls. It felt like she was descending into the throat of the earth itself. The darkness seemed to press in on her, heavy and suffocating. She could hear her own ragged breathing, the frantic beat of her own pulse. She was terrified, more terrified than she had ever been in her life, but she kept going. She had to. She reached the bottom. It was a tiny, cramped space, no bigger than a small closet, and barely tall enough for her to stand upright. Her flashlight beam swept across the walls, and she let out a small, involuntary gasp. They were lined with sheets of dark metal, riveted together. Tin or lead, she guessed. It was a crude but effective attempt at waterproofing, at protecting this space from the dampness of the earth. This wasn't just a cellar, it was a vault, a meticulously constructed hiding place, and there, sitting in the center of the stone floor, were the objects of this careful preservation. 2 metal boxes, about the size of toolboxes, their surfaces dark with age and crusted with oxidation. They were both secured with heavy, rusted padlocks, and lying beside them, as if placed there as an afterthought, was a thick, leather-bound book, a journal. A wave of dizziness washed over Eliza. This was it, the secret of the Miller barn, the source of the curse. It was real. With trembling hands, she reached for the journal first. The leather was cold and stiff, but remarkably preserved in the dry, cool air of the vault. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the ink, a dark, faded brown, was still legible. Her great-uncle's name was on the first page. A deep tremor ran through her body. This was his story. Then she turned her attention to the boxes. They were too heavy to carry both at once. She grabbed one, the cold metal seeping through her thin shirt, and with immense effort, she hauled it up the stone steps and out into the relative light of the barn. Luke and Sophie watched, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. The box sat on the dirt floor, a silent, imposing enigma. The lock was an impenetrable chunk of rust. It would take a key she would never find. A frantic, desperate energy seized her. She wasn't going to be stopped now, not after coming this far. She looked around and her eyes landed on a large, heavy rock near the foundation of the barn, one of the few solid things in the place. It was a primitive tool for a primitive act. She hefted the rock, its weight a shock to her tired arms, and brought it down on the padlock with all her might. The sound was a deafening shriek of metal on metal, a violent clang that made the children jump. The lock held. A surge of frustration and rage coursed through her. She lifted the rock again, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and slammed it down once more, and again and again. She was no longer just trying to open a box. She was smashing through a lifetime of helplessness, of poverty, of loss. The rusted metal groaned, bent, and then, with a final, sharp crack, the hasp snapped. The box was open. Silence fell, broken only by her own harsh breathing. For a long moment, she just stared at it, her hands shaking too violently to open the lid. The anticipation was a physical pain, a sharp, stabbing sensation in her chest. Slowly, as if in a dream, she reached out and lifted the heavy metal lid. Her mind, conditioned by months of deprivation, expected to find more filth, more decay, perhaps old tools or worthless trinkets. She was not prepared for what she saw. Nestled on a bed of what was once dark velvet lay dozens of stones. They were dull, greasy-looking, and irregular in shape, like dirty pieces of quartz or glass. A crushing wave of disappointment began to wash over her. It was just rocks, of course. Just a crazy old man's collection of worthless rocks. She felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. All this for nothing. Then she remembered the flashlight. She picked it up and shone its weak, wavering beam into the box. The world stopped. The dull, greasy stones didn't just reflect the light, they drank it, and then exploded it back at her in a blinding, kaleidoscopic spray of color. Brilliant flashes of blue, red, yellow, and green fire danced across the inside of the box, projecting a dazzling light show onto the rotting walls of the barn. They weren't rocks. They weren't glass. A single word formed in her mind, a word so impossible, so absurd, that her brain struggled to accept it. Diamonds. Raw, uncut diamonds. Dozens of them. Her breath hitched. Her vision swam. The flashlight fell from her numb fingers. Rolling to the side, she reached in and touched one. It was cool with sharp edges and felt impossibly real in her trembling hand. She lifted it into a stray beam of moonlight filtering through the roof, and it glittered with a cold, ancient fire. It was real. The fortune was real. A wave of vertigo so powerful it almost knocked her over swept through her. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob that was half terror, half disbelief. This was too much. It was too big. This kind of thing didn't happen to people like her. People like her lost their homes, counted their last dollars, and moved into ruined barns. They didn't find treasure. It felt like a trap, a cruel joke being played by a malevolent universe. She looked at the box of impossible light, then at her children, their small faces illuminated by the strange, glittering glow. This changed everything. This was not a solution. It was a cataclysm. A fortune like this didn't come without a story, without a price. The leather-bound journal, still waiting in the darkness of the cellar, suddenly felt like the most terrifying object in the world. The diamonds were the what. The journal was the why. And she had a sinking feeling the why was going to be far more dangerous than the what. Ignoring the first box for a moment, her mind now consumed with a new, urgent need, she scrambled back to the opening of the cellar. She had to see what was in the other one. Driven by a manic energy, she descended the steps again, the fear gone, replaced by a feverish, all-consuming curiosity. She grabbed the second box, which felt even heavier than the first, and dragged it up into the barn. She didn't hesitate this time. She grabbed the rock and smashed the lock with a few efficient blows. The lid popped open. More. It was filled to the brim with more of the same raw, uncut stones, a breathtaking hoard of raw wealth that defied imagination. The sheer quantity was staggering. It wasn't just a fortune, it was a king's ransom. It was enough money to solve every problem she had, and 1,000 more she hadn't even thought of. A hysterical, unbidden laugh escaped her lips, a wild, unhinged sound that echoed strangely in the decaying barn. The weight of the discovery settled on her like a physical shroud. This wasn't just money. This was a secret someone had died to protect. A secret someone had created a curse to hide. She was no longer just a destitute widow. She was the guardian of a dangerous, impossible truth. She looked from the glittering boxes to the dark, gaping more of the cellar where the journal still lay. The path had forked. Behind her was a life of quiet desperation she knew all too well. Ahead of her was a path paved with diamonds, leading into a darkness she couldn't possibly comprehend. The choice had been made for her the moment Luke's foot found that hollow board. She was in this story now, whether she wanted to be or not, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the most dangerous part was not finding the treasure. The most dangerous part was about to begin. She finally retrieved the journal, her hands shaking as she carried it into the light. The leather was worn smooth in places, a testament to the hands that had held it, that had written in it. She sat down on the dirt floor, the two open boxes of diamonds flanking her like a king's hoard, and opened the book. The children were quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. The first page was dated 1982. The handwriting was a tight, controlled script, the writing of a careful man. As her eyes scanned the first few lines, a cold dread began to creep up her spine, far colder than the damp air of the barn. The very first sentence confirmed her deepest fears. "I write this not as a record," it began, "but as a confession. May God have mercy on my soul, and on the souls of the men we wronged. It all began with the diamonds." The mystery of the barn was about to give way to the horror of its history. Eliza felt the world shrink until it was nothing but the yellowed pages of the book and the terrible words written on them. The glittering diamonds seemed to dim, their light tainted by the dark story that was beginning to unfold. She was holding a ghost in her hands, a story of greed, guilt, and death that had been waiting in the dark for 30 years. The barn was no longer just a ruin, it was a crime scene, and she, by unearthing its secret, had just made herself a witness. The feeling of elation from finding the fortune evaporated completely, replaced by a profound and terrifying sense of dread. She was no longer just poor and desperate. She was in danger. The weight of the journal in her lap felt heavier than both boxes of diamonds combined. Reading it would mean stepping fully into the darkness her great-uncle had left behind. Not reading it was impossible. She took a deep breath and continued to read. Night fell, draping the ruined barn in an impenetrable shroud of black. Eliza lit a single precious candle, its tiny flame a fragile warrior against the overwhelming darkness. The light flickered and danced, catching the facets of the diamonds in the open boxes, making them pulse with a cold, almost predatory light. The scent of wax mingled with the ever-present stench of mold and the dry, ancient smell of the journal in her lap. She felt a profound dread, a chilling premonition that the words on these pages would be far more costly than the stones glittering beside her. Her heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm of foreboding. Outside, the wind moaned through the holes in the walls, a mournful chorus to the grim story she was about to read. She took a shuddering breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and forced her eyes back to the tight, faded script of her great-uncle, a man she was beginning to wish had remained a ghost. Her hands were clammy, her stomach a tight knot of fear. She was about to unearth a truth that had been buried for a reason. The first few pages were a descent into a hell she could scarcely imagine. Her great-uncle's words painted a vivid, horrifying picture of the local mining boom in the 1980s. He wrote not of prosperity, but of a dark underworld operating in the shadows. He and his partner, a man named Jedediah Blackwood, had discovered a rich, untapped vein of diamonds, but instead of registering the claim, they chose a path of pure avarice. "We ran a shadow mine," the journal confessed, the words stark and chilling in the flickering light. "We recruited men from desperation, men with no families, no papers, no one to miss them." Eliza felt a wave of nausea. The bread she'd eaten earlier felt like a stone in her gut. She could almost hear the ghosts of these forgotten men. Their whispers carried on the wind that rattled the barn's loose planks. This wasn't a story of fortune. It was a story of exploitation, built on the backs of the invisible and the damned. The beautiful, glittering stones were stained with a history of human suffering. The journal described the conditions in sickening detail. The men worked in terrifying, unsafe tunnels for 16 hours a day. Their payment was a bunk in a filthy shed and a daily bowl of watery soup. They were prisoners, trapped by false debts and the ever-present threat of violence from Blackwood's foreman. The journal read, Jedediah called them human tools, disposable. The phrase made Eliza's blood run cold. She could feel her great-uncle's guilt seeping through the pages, a living entity that had survived for 3 decades in this cellar. He described his partner, Blackwood, as a man with a charisma that masked a heart of pure ice. A man who saw other humans only as instruments for his own enrichment. Eliza looked at her own children, sleeping fitfully on the thin blankets, their innocent faces a stark contrast to the depravity she was reading about. She felt a sudden, fierce urge to burn the journal, to bury the diamonds and run, but she knew it was too late. She was already entangled in this dark legacy. The confession grew darker. When the vein ran dry, Blackwood decided there could be no loose ends, no witnesses. The journal described a single horrific night. He said we had to retire the tools, her great-uncle wrote, the ink slightly smeared as if from a trembling hand. He and his men, they collapsed the main tunnel. On purpose. The men were still inside. A choked sob escaped Eliza's throat. The sound was swallowed by the vast, dark emptiness of the barn. She clamped a hand over her mouth, her body shaking uncontrollably. Murder. Mass murder. For rocks. The diamonds in the boxes suddenly felt radioactive, burning with the memory of the lives they had cost. Her great-uncle's share was his price for silence, a fortune he could never bring himself to spend. He was haunted, broken by his complicity. The journal was his final act, a desperate attempt at redemption. He detailed everything, planning to take it to the federal authorities and expose Blackwood's entire empire. The final entry was dated the day before his death. Jedediah knows, it read. The script hurried and panicked. He came to see me. He smiled that same cold smile. Told me accidents happen out here. The tractor is making a strange noise. I know he did something. I am hiding this confession and the diamonds. They are a curse, but they are also the proof. If I do not make it to town, the curse is real. But the curse is not the land. The curse is Jedediah Blackwood. Eliza stared at the words, her heart pounding in her throat. The local gossip, the freak accident. It was all a lie. Her great-uncle had been murdered, and the curse that kept everyone away from this barn for 30 years was not a ghost story. It was a calculated strategy, a guard dog made of fear, set in place by a killer to protect his secret. The isolation, the creepy stories, the suspicious neighbors. It was all part of Blackwood's long, patient plan, and she had just walked right into the middle of it. A full day passed in a haze of terror and indecision. Eliza hid the journal and the diamonds back in the cold cellar, slamming the heavy stone door shut as if she could seal the horrifying truth back in the earth. But the knowledge was a poison in her veins. She couldn't eat. She couldn't think. Every creak of the old barn, every gust of wind, sounded like a footstep, like a threat. She watched her children play their sad little games in the dirt, and all she could see were the ghosts of the men who had died for the glittering fortune beneath their feet. The $50 she'd arrived with seemed like an innocent sum now, a problem from a simpler, safer life. This new reality was a labyrinth of moral and physical danger. What could she do? Go to the local sheriff? The journal had mentioned he was in Blackwood's pocket. She was alone, a penniless widow against the most powerful, ruthless man in the county. Escape seemed impossible. The sound came late in the afternoon of the second day. It was a low, powerful purr, a sound so alien to this desolate place that it felt like an invasion. It was the sound of expensive, modern machinery, of wealth and power. Eliza's heart leaped into her throat. She scrambled to a crack in the barn wall and peered out. A sleek, black SUV, the kind she'd only ever seen in magazines, was making its way slowly up the overgrown path. It was freshly washed, its polished surface a mirror reflecting the ruin around it, a grotesque intrusion of the modern world into this forgotten pocket of time. Her breath hitched, she knew, with a certainty that turned her bones to ice, who was in that car. Jedediah Blackwood. He knew she was here. The curse had been disturbed, and its master had come to investigate. She felt a primal wave of fear, the terror of a mouse realizing the hawk is circling overhead. Her instinct was to grab her children and run, but there was nowhere to hide. The SUV stopped, and the engine was cut with a soft electronic sigh. The driver's door opened, and a man emerged. He was old, easily 80, but he moved with a disturbing vitality. He was tall and lean, dressed in expensive khaki trousers and a Crispiano white shirt, completely out of place in the mud and decay. He used a simple wooden cane, but it seemed more like a prop than a necessity, an accessory of age he wielded like a scepter. His hair was a perfect mane of silver, and his face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes, even from a distance, were sharp and intelligent, and cold. They were the coldest things Eliza had ever seen. This was Jedediah Blackwood. He stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated barn, the old car, the general state of squalor. A faint, unreadable expression crossed his face. Not pity, not disgust. It was something else, the look of a king surveying a forgotten, but still important corner of his kingdom. He began to walk toward the barn, his steps measured and confident. The tip of his cane made a soft, rhythmic tapping sound on the hard-packed earth. Tap, tap, tap. Each sound was a hammer blow against Eliza's frayed nerves. She backed away from the crack in the wall, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had to appear normal. She had to be a desperate widow, nothing more. "Luke, Sophie, stay behind me," she whispered, her voice tight with suppressed panic. She straightened her back, trying to project a confidence she was nowhere near feeling, and stepped out into the doorway to meet him, blinking in the harsh afternoon light. He stopped a few feet from her, his cold eyes taking in her disheveled appearance, her dirt-stained clothes, her frightened face. She could feel his gaze dissecting her, calculating her worth, her threat level. She felt incredibly small and vulnerable, a bug under his microscope. "Well now," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was even more unsettling than his appearance. It was a voice of easy authority, accustomed to being obeyed. "You must be Eliza, Thomas Miller's great niece. I heard someone had moved into this old wreck. I must say, I'm surprised." He smiled, but it was a performer's smile, a thin, bloodless stretching of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Jedediah Blackwood. I own most of the land around here. I knew your great-uncle. You know, A long time ago. The casual mention of her great-uncle sent a fresh jolt of terror through Eliza. He was testing her, watching her reaction. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her face a blank mask. I didn't have anywhere else to go," she stammered, playing the part of the destitute woman she truly was. The lie was in the omission, the terrible secret she was hiding just a few feet beneath the ground they stood on. Blackwood's eyes flickered for a moment toward the interior of the barn, lingering on the large area Eliza had cleared of hay. It was the spot right above the cellar. A cold sweat broke out on her neck. Did he know? Was it that obvious? He turned his gaze back to her, the false smile still fixed in place. A tough spot to be in, for a woman alone with 2 little ones. "This is no place for a family," he said, his voice dripping with faux concern. "The structure is rotten. The well is likely contaminated. It's just not safe." He leaned a little closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "To be frank, this property has a bit of a reputation. Bad things have happened here. People get hurt." The threat was no longer veiled. It was hanging in the air between them, thick and poisonous. He was reminding her of what happened to the last person who lived here. He let the silence hang for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then he straightened up, his tone becoming brisk and businesslike. "Look, I'll be direct. The place is an eyesore and a liability, but it's adjacent to my own holdings. I'll take it off your hands. Give you, say, $5,000, cash. Enough for you and your children to get a fresh start somewhere else, somewhere safe." The offer was an insult. $5,000 for land that held a fortune. It was a test. It was his way of confirming she hadn't found anything. If she accepted the pittance, it meant she was ignorant. If she refused, it meant she knew. Her mind raced. The roaring in her ears was so loud she could barely hear him. Her entire future, her children's very lives, depended on how she answered. She felt the weight of the murdered men, of her great-uncle's ghost, of the diamonds burning a hole in the earth beneath her feet. He saw the hesitation in her eyes. His smile tightened, becoming a fraction less friendly, a fraction more menacing. "It's a generous offer, considering the circumstances," he said, his voice losing its warm edge. "This is a lonely part of the county, Eliza. Things happen, a fire, a hunting accident. It's a dangerous place for a single woman who doesn't know the lay of the land." His eyes dropped to where Luke and Sophie were peeking out from behind her legs, and the implied threat became monstrously clear. He wasn't just threatening her, he was threatening her children. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken violence. He was a predator, patiently explaining the rules of the hunt to his cornered prey. He knew he had her trapped. He had all the power, all the control, or so he thought. He didn't know about the journal. Eliza felt a strange calm settle over her, the kind that comes when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. The fear was still there, a cold, hard stone in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a white-hot, protective rage. This man had threatened her children. He had murdered dozens of men and her own relative. He thought she was just another one of his victims. He was wrong. She looked him straight in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll need some time to think about it." It was a non-answer, a delay tactic, but it was a defiance he did not expect. A flicker of surprise, then annoyance, crossed his face. He had expected tears, a grateful acceptance. He had not expected resolve. He stared at her for a long moment, his cold eyes searching hers for the secret he was sure was there. He gave a curt nod, the mask of civility back in place. "Don't take too long," he said, his voice once again a silky threat. "Properties like this, they have a way of creating their own unfortunate accidents. It would be a shame if something were to happen before you made a decision." He turned without another word and walked back to his gleaming SUV, his cane tapping out a rhythm of finality on the path. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was a countdown. Eliza watched him go, her body trembling not from fear but from a terrifying newfound strength. The engine started and the vehicle drove away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the stench of its exhaust. She stood frozen in the doorway, her children clinging to her legs. The weight of her discovery now fused with the terrifying certainty of the danger they were in. She was holding a truth that could bring down an empire, but that same truth could get her and her children killed. What would you do in her place? Would you take the pittance and run for your life, or would you risk everything to see justice done for the dead? The silence Jedediah Blackwood left behind was more terrifying than his words. It was a vacuum, heavy with the phantom tapping of his cane and the echo of his veiled threats. Eliza's entire body trembled with a violent, reactive tremor, the adrenaline of their confrontation leaving her weak and nauseous. She herded the children back into the oppressive gloom of the barn, her movements jerky and robotic. The air itself felt charged, thick with danger. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner beating against its cage. Every shadow seemed to deepen and stretch, coalescing into menacing shapes in the corners of her vision. The barn was no longer a ruin, it was a cage, and the bars were made of her own poverty and isolation. She felt a profound sense of being watched, not just by the distant, suspicious neighbors, but by Blackwood himself, his cold eyes somehow still on her from miles away. The fortune beneath the floor was no longer a source of hope. It was bait in a trap, and she had already swallowed it whole. Her mind was a maelstrom of fear. She felt an overwhelming, primal urge to flee, to pack the children and the damning evidence into her car and just drive until the gas ran out, putting as many miles as possible between her family and this cursed land. But the thought died as quickly as it was born. A bitter, hysterical laugh almost escaped her lips. Flee with what? The gas tank was nearly empty, and the handful of dollars she had left wouldn't get them to the next county, let alone to safety. She was anchored here, chained to this spot by her destitution. Blackwood knew it. That was part of his cruel calculation. He hadn't just threatened her, he had reminded her of her own helplessness, rubbing salt in the wound of her failure. The feeling of being cornered, of having no viable options, was a physical weight crushing the air from her lungs. She looked at the heavy stone slab covering the cellar, and a new, colder fear seeped into her heart. The diamonds and the journal were the only weapons she had, but they were a double-edged sword that could just as easily be the instrument of her own demise. Night descended on the barn like a final judgment, thicker and more absolute than before. The wind picked up, no longer a mournful whisper, but a low, angry howl that tore at the rotting planks of the walls. It sounded like the world was screaming a warning. Eliza huddled with Luke and Sophie under their thin blankets, their small, warm bodies a fragile shield against the immense, cold terror that surrounded them. She couldn't light a candle tonight. Any light would be a beacon, advertising her presence to anyone watching from the darkness. So they sat in absolute blackness, a darkness so profound it felt solid, pressing in on all sides. She clutched her children, her ears straining to pass every sound, the groaning of the old wood, the scuttling of rats in the hay, the relentless shriek of the wind. Her imagination, fueled by terror, populated the night with unseen threats. Was that a footstep, the snap of a twig, or just the barn settling, breathing its last, dying breaths around them? Sleep was an impossible luxury. She was a sentry on duty, guarding her family from a ghost with a silver cane. Hours crawled by, each minute an eternity of suspense. Then a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was not the aggressive purr of Blackwood's SUV. It was a hesitant, rhythmic crunching of gravel and dirt. Footsteps, slow, unsteady, and close. Eliza's heart stopped. A wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over her, so potent it made her vision swim in the darkness. They had come back. Blackwood had sent his men to finish what he had started. She clamped a hand over Luke's mouth to stifle the whimper she knew was coming, pulling Sophie tighter against her body. Her mind raced, a frantic search for an escape route that didn't exist. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The footsteps stopped right outside the main doorway. The wind died down for a moment, and in the sudden, ringing silence, she heard a ragged, wheezing breath. It was the sound of an old man, struggling against the night and the exertion of the walk. The fear didn't subside, but it changed, twisted by a thread of confusion. This wasn't the sound of a predator. A faint, bobbing light appeared in the doorway, the weak yellow beam of an old-fashioned oil lantern. It cast long, dancing shadows and illuminated the figure holding it. It was a man, ancient and stooped, his frame so thin it seemed the wind might carry him away. He was wrapped in a heavy, patched coat despite the mildness of the night. and a worn wool cap was pulled down low over his brow. His face, illuminated from below by the lantern, was a geography of deep-set wrinkles, his cheeks hollowed by age. He peered into the darkness of the barn, his eyes wide with an emotion Eliza recognized instantly: fear. He looked just as terrified as she felt. "Mom!" he called out, his voice a dry, reedy rasp that was nearly snatched away by the wind. "Mrs. Miller's niece. Are you in there? I don't mean no harm." The plea in his voice was genuine, a stark contrast to the silky menace of Jedediah Blackwood. Eliza remained frozen in the shadows, her heart still pounding a frantic, uncertain rhythm. Was this another trap, a more subtle, insidious trick? The old man took a hesitant step inside, the lantern light swaying wildly, making the shadows leap and retreat like frightened animals. "I saw the big black car," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I saw him leave. Jedediah Blackwood. He ain't been on this property since the funeral." The man's eyes darted around the cavernous space, filled with a deep ancestral dread, as if he expected ghosts to materialize from the rotting hay. "My name is Hemlock, Arthur Hemlock. I live just down the way. Past the stone wall." He gestured vaguely into the darkness with a gnarled, trembling hand. Eliza slowly emerged from the shadows, her children still clinging to her, a silent tableau of fear and desperation. The sight of them seemed to startle the old man even more. His face, an already pale, lost all its remaining color. He looked at her, then at the two small children, and a look of profound sorrow and guilt washed over his features. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "He's going to do it again." The statement hung in the air, a cryptic and terrifying prophecy. Eliza found her voice, though it was hoarse and weak. "Do what again?" she asked, her mind instantly connecting his words to the journal hidden beneath their feet. Mr. Hemlock seemed to wrestle with a lifetime of silence. His gaze drifted from Eliza to the spot in the center of the barn where she had cleared the hay, the place where the dirt was still disturbed. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of understanding, of horror, dawning within them. He knew. He didn't know everything, but he knew something was here. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I shouldn't be here. I swore to my wife on her deathbed I'd never speak of it. But seeing you, seeing those little ones, and seeing his car, I can't carry it no more. It's too heavy." The confession seemed to drain the last of his strength, and he leaned against the doorframe, the lantern casting his stooped silhouette against the stormy sky outside. He looked like a man confessing on his deathbed. "Your great-uncle, Thomas," Hemlock began, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if the very walls had ears. "He wasn't a bad man, a bit lost, maybe, got in with the wrong sort. Everyone knew Blackwood was poison. But there was money to be made, and people were desperate." He spoke of the past as if it were yesterday, the memories vivid and raw. The night he died, it wasn't no accident. It wasn't no tractor malfunction. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Her body went cold, a confirmation of a truth she already knew but was terrified to hear spoken aloud. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. Hemlock's eyes were distant, looking back across 3 decades of fear. "I was out, checking my snares, over by the woods." He pointed a trembling finger toward the back of the barn. "I saw them, 2 of Blackwood's men, the ones he used for his dirty work. They were working on your uncle's tractor with a wrench and a pair of cutters. They were laughing, a low, ugly sound." He shuddered at the memory, a violent tremor that shook his frail body. Eliza felt a wave of dizziness. The journal had given her the motive, but this old man, this ghost from the past, he was giving her the act itself. He was an eyewitness. "I hid," Hemlock continued, his voice cracking. "I was a young man with a new wife and a baby on the way. You didn't cross Jedediah Blackwood. Not then, not now. He owned the sheriff, the judge, everything. To speak against him was to sign your own death warrant. I stayed hidden in the trees until they left." He paused, swallowing hard, the memory clearly painful. "Later that night, I heard the tractor start up. It made a god-awful screeching sound, then the crash down in the ravine. I knew right then what they'd done, what he'd done." The guilt in his voice was a palpable thing, a heavy cloak he had worn for 30 years. "I never said a word. I let everyone believe the story, The curse. It was easier. It was safer. I was a coward. A single tear traced a path through the deep gullies of his wrinkled cheek, glistening in the lantern light before disappearing into the white stubble of his jaw. Seeing his raw, ancient guilt, Eliza felt a strange kinship with this terrified old man. He was not a threat. He was a fellow prisoner of Jedediah Blackwood's long, dark reign. A split-second decision, born of desperation and a sudden, powerful intuition, made her act. She had to trust someone, and the universe had just delivered this broken, repentant soul to her door. "He wrote it all down," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Hemlock's head snapped up, his eyes wide with confusion. "Who?" he rasped. "My great-uncle," Eliza clarified, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Before he died, he wrote it all down in a journal, the mine, the stolen diamonds, the men they killed." She gestured to the floor. "He hid it. Here. With his share of the diamonds." The words felt dangerous and powerful as she spoke them aloud for the first time to another living person. She was sharing the burden, and in doing so, she was multiplying the danger, but also, just maybe, multiplying her chances of survival. This was the turning point. She was no longer just a victim. She was part of an alliance. Mr. Hemlock stared at her, his mouth agape, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The vague, shadowy guilt he had carried for 30 years had just been given a name and a shape, and it was a monster far more terrible than he had ever imagined. "Diamonds," he stammered, the words sounding alien on his tongue. My God! So the stories, they were true. He looked at the spot on the floor, then back at Eliza, a new, frantic urgency in his eyes. The fear for his own long-past cowardice was gone, replaced by a sharp, immediate terror for her and her children. "You have to get out of here," he said, his voice rising with panic. "Not tomorrow, not in an hour. Now, if he even suspects you know, if he thinks you found that, he won't just threaten you next time. He will erase you, him and his whole rotten family. They'll bury you and your children right here on this land and call it another accident, and no one will ever say a word. You have to run." The wind outside shrieked in agreement. A sudden, violent gust that made the whole barn groan in protest. As if summoned by his panic, the distant rumble of thunder that had been a faint promise on the horizon now became a deep, percussive roar that vibrated through the soles of their feet. A brilliant flash of lightning lit up the clearing outside, and for a split second the interior of the barn was illuminated in a stark, bluish-white light, revealing every detail of the decay. The moment of light was followed by an even deeper, more profound darkness. The storm was no longer approaching. It was upon them. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, hitting the metal sections of the roof with loud, sporadic pings that quickly escalated into a deafening, continuous roar. The sound was overwhelming, a chaotic drumming that drowned out all other noise. The wind howled, and the rain came down in solid sheets, blurring the world outside the doorway into a churning, watery chaos. The storm was a perfect cover, for escape or for an attack. A cold, hard knot of dread formed in Eliza's stomach. They had waited too long. It was too late. Hemlock grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong for such a frail man. "My place," he shouted over the din of the storm. "It's not much, but it's safe. It's hidden. We have to go now. Grab the children." His panic was contagious, a virus that spread through Eliza's already frayed nervous system. She turned to scoop up a sleeping Sophie, her mind a whirlwind of frantic thoughts. The journal, the diamonds. She couldn't leave the proof, but just as she moved, another sound sliced through the roar of the rain, a sound that made her blood run cold. It was the guttural, angry growl of a powerful truck engine, its tires churning and slipping in the new mud of the path. The sound was getting closer, much closer. Headlights, brighter and whiter than the lightning, swept across the front of the barn, piercing the darkness and pinning them in their glare like cornered animals. The truck skidded to a halt just feet from the doorway, its engine idling with a low, menacing rumble. This was it. The countdown was over. 2 doors slammed shut in quick succession. The silhouettes of 2 large men detached themselves from the glare of the headlights. They were huge, their broad shoulders and thick necks outlined against the storm. They were not there to talk. They were not there to threaten. The time for subtlety was over. One of them held a long, heavy crowbar. its metal tip glinting in the rain. The other carried a high-powered flashlight whose beam cut through the deluge like a laser, sweeping across the interior of the barn. "Blackwood said to check the floor," one of them yelled to the other, his voice a brutish bark that was barely audible over the storm. "He wants the boxes, and he wants them scared, real scared." Eliza's heart stopped. She stumbled back into the deepest shadows of the barn, pulling Luke and a now-crying Sophie with her. There was no escape. They were trapped. The two men took a step toward the entrance, their boots sinking into the mud, their intentions radiating from them in waves of pure, brutal violence. In that split second of paralyzing terror, Mr. Hemlock moved. The decades of fear and cowardice fell away from him, replaced by a desperate, sacrificial bravery. He shoved the lantern into Eliza's hands. "The back," he hissed, his voice urgent and raw. "There's a loose plank near the east wall. Get through it and run for the woods. My house is straight through, past the old stone wall. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything." His eyes, for the first time, held no fear, only a fierce, outprotective resolve. "I'm going to give you a head start. Go." Before Eliza could protest, before she could even process his words, he slipped away from her side, disappearing like a ghost into a different, darker part of the barn. She was left alone, her children clinging to her, the lantern light trembling in her hand, the sound of the approaching henchmen filling her with an unspeakable dread. She heard them entering the barn, their heavy boots sloshing in the puddles on the floor, their flashlight beam cutting through the gloom searching. A moment later, a deafening blast tore through the night. It was the unmistakable, booming report of a shotgun fired from the far side of the clearing, away from the woods. The sound was so loud it momentarily eclipsed the roar of the storm. "What the hell was that?" one of the henchmen yelled, startled. "Over there!" the other shouted. "Did the old man have a gun?" Their flashlight beam swung wildly towards the source of the sound, and Eliza heard them begin to run in that direction, their heavy footsteps receding. It was the diversion. It was her chance. A surge of pure adrenaline, cold and sharp, shot through her. There was no time to think, only to act. She grabbed the journal from the floor, shoving it inside her jacket. She scooped up a small cloth bag and frantically stuffed a handful of the heavy, rough diamonds into it. Proof. "Run!" she screamed to Luke, grabbing his hand. She hoisted a terrified, sobbing Sophie onto her hip, and with the lantern in her other hand, she plunged toward the back of the barn, praying Hemlock's words were true. She found it, a section of the wall where the planks were rotted through, leaving a gap just big enough to squeeze through. She pushed Luke through first, then scrambled out after him into the lashing rain and the chaos of the storm. The wind hit her with physical force, trying to tear Sophie from her arms. The ground was a treacherous soup of mud and wet leaves. Lightning flashed again, and in the stark, terrifying illumination, she saw the tree line, a solid wall of black just 100 yards away. It looked like the edge of the world. Behind her, she heard shouting. They had realized the trick. "She's getting away, the back," a voice roared. There was no more time. Eliza didn't look back. She ran. She ran with a desperation she had never known, a strength born of pure, maternal terror. The mud sucked at her shoes, trying to pull her down. Rain blinded her, plastering her hair to her face. Sophie's terrified sobs were a constant, heartbreaking rhythm against her ear. They plunged into the tree line, the darkness of the woods swallowing them whole. The forest was a nightmare of unseen obstacles and terrifying sounds. Branches, invisible in the dark, whipped at her face and tore at her clothes. Thorny vines grabbed at her ankles, trying to trip her. She stumbled, fell to one knee, the impact jarring her teeth. The lantern crashed to the ground and the flame was instantly extinguished, plunging them into absolute, terrifying blackness. She cried out, a sound of pure despair. "Mommy!" Luke screamed, his voice thin with panic beside her. She could hear the men crashing through the undergrowth behind them, their powerful flashlight beam cutting swaths through the trees, getting closer. She couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. She pushed herself back to her feet, her body screaming in protest. She pulled Luke along, her other arm locked around Sophie. They ran blind, guided only by instinct and the desperate hope that Hemlock's house was somewhere ahead in this terrifying, storm-racked darkness. Every step was a gamble, every shadow a monster. She could hear the men's voices clearly now, angry and frustrated, disturbingly close. "Spread out!" "She can't have gone far," one of them yelled. Their lights crisscrossed through the woods, the beams slicing through the rain-swept darkness, just yards from where Eliza and the children were now hiding, pressed flat against the wet earth behind a massive fallen log. Eliza held her breath, her heart feeling as if it would explode from her chest. She could smell the wet dirt, the scent of pine needles, and the acrid scent of her own fear. Sophie had buried her face in Eliza's neck, her small body trembling uncontrollably, but blessedly silent. Luke was frozen beside her, his hand gripping hers with painful intensity. A beam of light passed directly over their heads, so close she could feel the heat of it. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, preparing for the feel of a heavy hand on her shoulder, for the end. The light passed. The footsteps moved on, further to the left. They hadn't been seen. The moment of relief was so intense, it was painful. A sharp, stabbing gasp of air into lungs that had been starved of it, but they were not safe. Not yet. The men were still out there, beating the woods, a net of light and violence closing in around them. She had to keep moving. Waiting here was a death sentence. She waited for the next clap of thunder, a deep, rolling boom that shook the very ground. Using the sound to cover their movement, she pulled Luke to his feet and whispered, "Now." Quietly. They moved through the undergrowth like ghosts, bent low, their bare hands feeling for trees and roots to guide them in the suffocating darkness. The mud was ankle-deep in places, a cold, greedy sludge that tried to steal their shoes with every step. Her lungs burned. Her muscles screamed. Every nerve was alight with a singular, primal purpose: to get her children to safety. She didn't know how long they ran. Time had dissolved into a terrifying sequence of lightning flashes and thunderclaps, of stumbling through darkness and hiding in terror. Her mind was a singular point of focus. Straight ahead, past the stone wall, she had lost all sense of direction, guided only by a blind, desperate faith in a dead man's words and a coward's final act of bravery. Then, through the trees, she saw it. Another flash of lightning illuminated a low, crumbling wall of fieldstones, covered in moss and half swallowed by the forest. The stone wall, a surge of desperate hope, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees, flooded through her. He hadn't lied. It was real. They were close. She could hear the shouts of the men behind them, further away now, their voices muffled by the trees and the relentless roar of the storm. They had gained some ground, but they were not safe yet. She scrambled over the low wall, scraping her hands on the rough, slick stones and pulled the children over after her. Just beyond the wall, the woods thinned slightly. Another 100 feet of desperate, stumbling flight, and they broke through the tree line into a small, secluded clearing. And there it was, a tiny cabin, little more than a shack, with a single, warm, yellow light glowing in one window. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, instantly flattened and torn apart by the wind and rain. It was the most beautiful sight Eliza had ever seen. It was a beacon of hope in a world of darkness. It was sanctuary. "We're here," she sobbed, the words a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We're here. We made it." She half dragged, half carried her children the last few feet across the muddy yard, and collapsed against the solid wood of the cabin door, her free hand banging weakly against it. The sound was pathetic, a feeble tap-tap-tap against the overwhelming symphony of the storm, but it was enough. She had brought them through the darkness. The door was thrown open almost instantly. Mr. Hemlock stood there, his shotgun still in his hand, his face pale and etched with frantic worry. Seeing them soaked, mud-caked, and terrified but alive, the tension drained from his face, replaced by a wave of profound relief. "Thank God," he breathed, pulling them inside, out of the storm, into the warmth and safety of his small home. He quickly barred the door behind them, the heavy thud of the wooden beam sliding into place, the most reassuring sound Eliza had ever heard. The cabin was a single room, dominated by a crackling fire in a stone hearth that filled the space with a warm orange glow and the comforting smell of burning pine. It was cramped and cluttered, but it was dry, it was warm, and it was safe. For now, Eliza slid down to the floor, her back against the door, finally allowing the full weight of their terrifying flight to crash down upon her. She was shaking so violently she could barely hold her children, who clung to her, their own small bodies racked with sobs of relief. Mr. Hemlock took the shotgun and leaned it carefully by the door. He moved to the fire and returned with 2 thick wool blankets, his movements stiff and slow. He wrapped one around Eliza and the children. The rough, dry warmth, a shocking, wonderful sensation against their cold, wet skin. "They're still out there," he said, his voice a low, grim rumble as he peered through a small, grimy window into the storm. "They won't give up easy. Blackwood will be furious." Eliza looked at the old man, this unlikely savior who had risked his life for them. She saw the fear still in his eyes, but it was tempered now by a hard, unyielding resolve. In his small, cluttered cabin, surrounded by the chaos of the storm and the threat of the men hunting them in the woods, Eliza felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt since her husband's death. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was something more primal. It was the will to fight. She was no longer just running. She was now part of a war, and she held the one weapon that could actually win it. Eliza's exhausted mind, numbed by the terror of the chase, slowly began to function again. The immediate danger had passed, but the larger threat loomed, as vast and dark as the storm outside. Blackwood's men were still in the woods. They knew she had escaped. They knew she had help. Blackwood would not stop until he had the journal and the diamonds, and until he had silenced everyone who knew his secret. The small, warm cabin felt like a temporary reprieve, a tiny island in the middle of a raging, shark-infested ocean. She looked at Mr. Hemlock, who was staring into the fire, his face a mask of grim contemplation. He had saved them tonight, but he had also signed his own death warrant. By helping her, he had made himself Blackwood's enemy, a loose end to be snipped. The weight of that responsibility settled on Eliza's shoulders, a new burden on top of all the others. She had not only endangered her children, she had dragged this old, guilt-ridden man into her nightmare. Her heart ached with a fresh wave of guilt. "There's a phone," Hemlock said suddenly, his voice startling her. He pointed with a gnarled finger to an ancient black rotary phone sitting on a small, dusty table in the corner. "It's a landline. Still works, most of the time. The storm might have taken it out, but we have to try." The suggestion hung in the air, both a lifeline and a terrifying risk. Who could they call? The local sheriff was in Blackwood's pocket. Calling him would be like reporting a wolf to the farmer who owned it. They needed someone outside Blackwood's sphere of influence, someone with real power, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. But who? Eliza felt a fresh wave of hopelessness. They were 2 nobodies, a destitute widow and a reclusive old man against a deeply entrenched criminal empire. It was an impossible fight. She felt the small, heavy bag of diamonds still clutched in her hand. They were proof, yes, but they were also a curse, a magnet for violence that would follow them wherever they went. Mr. Hemlock seemed to read her thoughts. "My boy," he said, his voice soft but filled with a father's pride. "My son, he's a lawyer, a damn good one, up in New York City." He looked at Eliza, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. "He doesn't work for fancy corporations. He helps people, people like us. He's one of them. A public interest lawyer." The words, spoken in the simple rustic cabin, sounded like a message from another world. A lawyer, in New York City. It was a connection to a world of power and justice that Eliza had thought was forever out of her reach. "He never believed me," Hemlock confessed, a note of sadness in his voice. "When I tried to tell him about the things that go on around here, the way Blackwood runs this county like his own personal kingdom, he thought I was just a crazy old man spinning yarns. But with this," he gestured to the journal, which was still tucked, damp but safe, inside Eliza's jacket. "With your story, with real proof, maybe he'll finally listen. Maybe he can do something." The fragile possibility began to take root in Eliza's mind. The fire crackled, spitting sparks onto the stone hearth. Outside, the storm raged on, a relentless assault of wind and rain. The children had finally cried themselves to sleep, their small bodies limp with exhaustion, huddled under the heavy blanket. The quiet of the cabin was a fragile thing, a temporary truce in a war that was far from over. The image of the 2 men, their faces grim and brutal in the glare of the headlights, was burned into Eliza's memory. They were not just thugs. They were soldiers in Blackwood's army. and they would be back. Fear was still a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but now it was mixed with something else, a cold, hard anger. They had threatened her children. They had tried to hunt her down like an animal. They had underestimated her. They saw a weak, desperate widow, and they were right. She was, but they had failed to see the one thing that made her dangerous. She had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The terrified seamstress was gone, burned away in the desperate flight through the woods. A different woman was beginning to emerge from the ashes. Eliza looked at the old rotary phone. It was a relic from another time, but it represented their only path forward, their only chance to fight back. It was a gateway out of this isolated, corrupt world, and into a world where a man like Jedediah Blackwood could not act with impunity. The risk was enormous. A phone call could be traced. It could lead Blackwood's men right to their door, but staying here, hiding and waiting for the inevitable, was not an option. That was a death sentence. The choice was clear. It was the same choice she had made when she decided to run, the same choice Hemlock had made when he fired his shotgun. It was the choice to fight, to take the offensive, to stop being the prey and, for the first time, to become the hunter. She met Mr. Hemlock's gaze across the firelit room and gave him a single, determined nod. The fear was still there, a constant, cold companion. But for the first time in a very long time, it was no longer in control. They would make the call. They would bring the thunder down on Jedediah Blackwood. Mr. Hemlock's trembling hand hovered over the rotary phone, the plastic cool and alien in the warm cabin. His knuckles were white. Outside, the wind howled a deafening, chaotic symphony. Inside, the only sounds were the crackling fire and Eliza's own heart, a frantic drum against her ribs. He lifted the heavy receiver, the dial tone a faint, miraculous hum beneath the storm's static. He began to dial, the slow, rhythmic zip-zip-zip of the rotary mechanism, a torturous countdown. Eliza stood guard by the small window, peering into the churning blackness, her body a coiled spring of terror. "It's ringing," Hemlock rasped. A lifetime of fear was in that sound. Then, a voice, distant and tinny, crackled through the earpiece. Hemlock sagged with relief. "Daniel, it's your father," he began, his voice breaking, a torrent of guilt and terror held back for 3 decades finally bursting free. "Son, you have to listen to me. I was a coward, but I can't be anymore. Something terrible is happening." The initial disbelief in his son's voice was audible even from where Eliza stood. A skeptical patience for what he must have assumed was an old man's paranoid rambling, but Hemlock's words, raw and unvarnished, painted a picture of the murder he had witnessed, a confession that bled through the crackling phone line with the power of absolute truth. The skepticism on the other end turned to stunned silence. Hemlock then handed the phone to Eliza, his hand shaking violently. She took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of damp wool and old wood grounding her. Her voice, and when she spoke, was not the trembling whisper of a victim, but the firm, clear tone of a witness. She recounted the horrors from the journal, the slave mine, the collapse, the names. "I have the proof," she stated, her voice ringing with newfound authority. His journal, his confession, and the diamonds. The energy on the line shifted. The son's voice was suddenly sharp, focused, all doubt erased. "Moments ago I was listening to my father. Now I'm listening to a case. Don't move and don't speak to anyone. I'm making a call. Stay by that phone." The waiting was a new form of torture. The storm eventually exhausted itself, its fury receding into a steady, dripping rain that gave way to an eerie, pre-dawn silence. Every drip from the eaves, every rustle of a leaf outside, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Eliza's system. She and Hemlock sat in silence, taking turns peering through the grimy window at the grey, featureless wall of trees. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing orange embers, its warmth fading. The children slept on, oblivious, their peaceful faces a painful counterpoint to the raging anxiety in Eliza's chest. Had they been forgotten? Was the son's promise just an empty platitude to calm a hysterical woman and a senile old man? She clutched the rough cloth bag in her lap, the hard, angular shapes of the diamonds pressing into her palm. The weight was immense, a physical anchor of both her potential salvation and her potential doom. The hope that had flared so brightly now flickered, threatening to be extinguished by the cold, lonely light of dawn. It wasn't the sound of a local sheriff's car. It was the absence of sound that came first. A pair of dark, nondescript sedans rolled into the main clearing by the barn, their movements quiet and deliberate. They were followed by a larger black van that parked alongside them, its tinted windows revealing nothing. Men in dark jackets with the bold yellow letters FBI stitched on the back emerged, moving with a calm, unnerving professionalism that was utterly alien to the rustic decay of the landscape. They fanned out, securing the perimeter, their actions economical and precise. It was a surreal, unbelievable sight. This was not the clumsy, corrupt power of Jedediah Blackwood. This was something else entirely, a force from a different reality, descending upon this forgotten corner of the world. Watching from the cabin window, Eliza felt her breath catch in her throat. A wave of dizziness washed over her, a volatile cocktail of terror and a wild, soaring hope. They were real. Help was real. She had not been abandoned in the dark. A senior agent, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached the cabin with Mr. Hemlock's son, who had arrived with them. The young lawyer's face was a mixture of shock at his father's story and grim determination. Introductions were brief. Inside the small cabin, the air thick with tension, Eliza laid out the evidence on the rough-hewn wooden table, the leather-bound journal, the small bag of raw diamonds that glittered obscenely in the morning light. The agent put on a pair of gloves before touching the journal, her expression hardening. As she read a few key passages, Eliza pointed out, Mr. Hemlock, his voice trembling but steady, gave his official statement, the words he had held inside for 30 years finally being recorded. It was a baptism of truth, washing away the stain of his long cowardice. The FBI agents spoke in low, clipped tones into their radios, a quiet symphony of impending justice. The vast, corrupt empire of Jedediah Blackwood was about to be dismantled from a tiny, dilapidated cabin in the woods. The arrest was not a dramatic, siren-wailing spectacle. It was a quiet, brutally efficient operation. While a team secured the barn and began the process of excavating the cellar, the main FBI convoy rolled silently up the long, manicured driveway to Blackwood's sprawling estate. Eliza, watching from the safety of the cabin, could only imagine the scene, which the agent later described in detail. Jedediah Blackwood, dressed in an expensive silk robe, enjoying his morning coffee and newspaper in his sun-drenched study, the picture of untouchable power, the flicker of confusion, then outrage on his face as federal agents flooded his home. He began to bluster, to threaten, to name-drop the powerful men he owned, but his words were met with the cold, impassive stare of federal law. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs being fastened around his wrinkled wrists was a sound that echoed 30 years of deferred justice. The local sheriff, arriving to assist, found his own wrists being bound, his face a mask of disbelief as his world crumbled around him. The story exploded across the nation. News vans, with their towering satellite dishes, descended upon the small, sleepy county like an invading army. The tale was irresistible. The destitute widow, the cursed barn, the hidden fortune in diamonds, the mass grave of forgotten men, and the shadowy tycoon who had reigned like a king for half a century. Jedediah Blackwood became the face of corporate evil, his picture plastered on every screen. The FBI's case, built on the unshakable foundation of the journal and Hemlock's testimony, grew stronger by the day as the dam of fear broke. Locals, emboldened by Blackwood's fall, came forward with their own stories of intimidation, land grabs, and violence. The curse of the Miller property was finally understood for what it was, a wall of fear built by a monster. Shielded from the media frenzy, Eliza watched the downfall of the man who had threatened her children, feeling not triumph but a quiet, profound sense of catharsis. The ghosts of the barn were finally being heard. The trial was a formality. Faced with incontrovertible evidence, the journal's detailed confession, Hemlock's unwavering eyewitness account, and forensic evidence unearthed from the collapsed shadow mine, Jedediah Blackwood was convicted of a litany of crimes, including multiple counts of first-degree murder. He would spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary, a powerless old man stripped of his wealth and name, the diamond fortune, legally the proceeds of crime. was seized by the federal government. But in a landmark ruling, the presiding judge, moved by the extraordinary circumstances, cited Eliza's uncommon courage in the face of mortal danger. A substantial portion of the fortune's assessed value was awarded to her and her children as both a reward for her role in bringing down a criminal empire and as compensation for the trauma they had endured. Justice, it turned out, sometimes came with a reward. The money was a staggering sum, enough to rewrite her life, to erase the debts, and to build a new future on the ashes of her past. A year later, the only sound is the happy, rhythmic whir of a state-of-the-art sewing machine. Eliza sits in a bright, sun-drenched room, the scent of fresh linen and hot coffee filling the air. Outside the large picture window, Luke and Sophie's laughter echoes across a lush, green lawn as they chase a soccer ball. The horrifying memories of the barn, of the cold and the hunger and the fear have faded, replaced by the vibrant reality of this new life. The house is safe and warm, filled not with the stench of mold, but with the aroma of the bread she has baking in the oven. She is no longer just a seamstress patching up worn-out clothes for a few dollars. She is a designer, creating beautiful things from bolts of silk and cotton, her passion reignited, her talent finally unleashed. She pauses her work, her hands, once trembling with hunger and fear, now steady and sure. She looks at her children, their faces bright with joy, and a deep, profound peace settles over her, a feeling of security so complete it feels like a dream. The fortune she received was a key, unlocking a door to a life she never thought possible. But the true treasure wasn't the money. It was the justice she had secured for the dead and the safety she had won for the living. With a portion of the funds, she worked with Mr. Hemlock's son to anonymously establish a foundation dedicated to helping the families of exploited workers, turning a fortune born of greed into a legacy of hope. The widow who had reached the absolute bottom in a cursed, rotting barn had not only saved herself, she had redeemed the past. Eliza's story is a powerful testament to the fact that even when all hope seems lost, the courage of a single person can be enough to topple an empire and bring light into the darkest of places. If her incredible journey from despair to redemption moved you, make sure you are subscribed to our channel and click that notification bell. You won't want to miss the unforgettable stories of resilience we uncover next.